Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. The Trump transition has made 12 cabinet picks so far. Some have been widely lauded, others not. But perhaps none has stirred a fiercer reaction on the left than the nominee for Secretary of State, longtime ExxonMobil CEO Rex Tillerson. Attacked as a tool of big business, a pawn of Vladimir Putin, Tillerson is likely to have boisterous nomination hearings. Among the most upset are environmental groups who object to what Mr. Tillerson does for a living. For example, Fred Krupp, who's the longtime president of the Environmental Defense Fund, greeted the Tillerson news this way, quote, President-elect Trump's nomination of ExxonMobil CEO for Secretary of State is another sign that he is putting the interests of the oil and gas industry ahead of the interests of the American people. Well, Mr. Krupp joins us now. Fred, thanks for coming on.
Delighted to be here.
So I think of you as kind of a reasonable guy, an environmentalist, but sort of market-oriented, and that seemed like a kind of a knee-jerk response to the nomination of Rex Tillerson, maybe more aimed at your donors in West L.A. than at the rest of the country. You really think that Trump appointed him so he could increase the fortunes of the oil and gas business?
No, you know, Tucker, I think we should take a step back from Mr. Tillerson. The question is the entire slate of nominees from the president-elect.
Well, this was Mr. Tillerson you were referring to, I think.
Yes, but he's part of a slate. I don't object to having a business voice in the cabinet. That makes a lot of sense. But when you look at the fact that it's Mr. Perry who railroaded through fast-track 13 permits to build coal-fired power plants in Texas, when you look at the fact that Scott Pruitt, head of EPA, has also sided with the oil and gas industry and tried to rip down every air pollution safeguard, that's the issue. It's a question of balance. This cabinet is way out of balance on these issues.
But with respect, this is what guests always do when they don't want to answer a direct question. They deflect it to something much larger. It's not really about it's about a larger question. I'm asking you to respond to a quote from you about Rex Tillerson saying, this is a sign that Trump is putting the interests of the oil and gas business ahead of those of America. And I'm just saying, it's a pretty heavy charge. Do you have any evidence for it?
Well, the evidence is when you look at the cabinet, there are three people that I just mentioned, all representing one point of view. Right. Good policy, Tucker, I believe, is when you have a diversity of views. Now, you know, in terms of, I appreciate you mentioned that, you know, the Environmental Defense Fund is market-oriented. We've worked with President Reagan and his cabinet. We've worked with President Bush, father and son. Just this past year, we passed the toxic safety bill, 403 votes to 12 in the House of Representatives. We don't have a knee-jerk response, but what we'd like to see is balance, and especially at the EPA, Mr. Pruitt is outside of the mainstream.
You don't like Mr. Pruitt, but I'm talking about, I mean, this is a Secretary of State, and what I found so dishonest about the statement is that you're actually not on a completely different page from Rex Tillerson. He's come out for a carbon tax. He was supportive of the Paris Agreement this spring. Those are positions that you have. Oh, you've lost audio. Can you hear me? Mr. Krupp? Unfortunately, he can't. We will come back to Fred Krupp. I think we're working on the audio right now. So the point is, look, if you can hear me, Mr. Krupp, that Rex Tillerson is not on the opposite side of you on these issues. The guy's for a carbon tax. He's been on the Democratic side of a bunch of climate issues, but you don't say that at all, nor do you point out that CO2 emittance in the United States have gone down relative to those in other industrialized countries, in part because of exploration done by ExxonMobil, which has made gas more affordable as opposed to coal for our electricity generation. So that's like a real point that you ignore because it's not serving your interest in fundraising.
No, actually, Tucker, we don't make judgments on the basis of fundraising. I'll tell you right now, I appreciate the fact that Mr. Tillerson has acknowledged that climate change is a real problem, and I appreciate the fact that he's voiced support for not only a carbon fee, but also the Paris Agreement. And I think it's good for America that the price of natural gas has gone down, thanks to exploration and innovation. I acknowledge all of that. It does concern me that Mr. Tillerson, as head of Exxon and part of the American Petroleum Institute, has been against safeguards to make sure that we don't waste natural gas by throwing it into the air. It does concern me that he's part of a slate of candidates that represents just one view, and getting, you know, back to my major concern about the selection and the nominee that we are opposing, Scott Pruitt. We're putting him in charge of an agency when he has built his career out of tearing down protections of the American public from clean air. The good neighbor rule is a rule designed to prevent bad air from wafting into states. It saves 34,000 lives a year. Mr. Pruitt has been against that. He's been against protections on mercury.
Well, to say that it saves 34,000 lives a year, I mean, that, look, we're getting into the realm of the speculative when you start saying things like that. I mean, I think you've got a point of view, and that's fine. Here's what makes honest dialogue impossible. When you and people like you use the term denier to describe people who are asking, in some cases, entirely legitimate questions about climate science. And isn't the essence of science that you form a hypothesis based on observation, and then you test and you retest that hypothesis? You are basically saying that people who ask questions should be shut down. And in fact, you've espoused using the power of government to crush those people in encouraging prosecutors.
Doctor, I don't think that's fair. First of all, I haven't used the term denier in talking
to you,
does. So I don't know.
I was just on the Environmental Defense Fund website, and you're calling people deniers who are, in some cases, asking totally reasonable questions. Isn't that
absolutely science is based on questioning, and we're for that.
Right.
And but forget it. Putting climate science to one side, the concern about Scott Pruitt is he's been out of the mainstream on American health protection.
But you are not answering my questions. You're instead diverting. Look, I know you have many concerns, and I do too, but I'm asking you a specific question about the use of the term denier, which is, in fact, in its use, anti-science. People who are committed to the scientific method would never use the term denier. That's the kind of language that religious people use. You have a catechism. You're defending against all comers. Science is welcoming and open-minded. So will you pledge now to stop using that word and to ask your employees to do the same?
I understand your point on denier. I will say this, that the science on climate is clear that we do have an Earth that's warming because of human-caused pollution. And so whether you use the term denier or skeptic, I understand you have a preference for one and maybe not the other. The point is, it's legitimate to question all the projections and the models, but the basic truth is the Earth is in a lot of trouble, and so are we, and that science is settled by the vast majority of scientists. Okay, then let me ask you, since you believe the science is settled,
if we can agree that the Earth appears to be warming, to what extent is that the result of human activity, and to what extent is it the result of natural cycles over which we have no control?
Tucker, there's no question.
Since the science is settled.
There is no question that natural cycles play a part. There is no question.
How big a part? Since the science is settled, you would know the proportion. How big a part?
Of the incremental warming we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, less than 10%.
What's the number, would you say?
The models tease this out. So human-caused warming is the overwhelming cause.
So it's less than 10%. What's the number? Since you do this for a living and you're familiar with the science, I just want to hold you to it, if I could.
Yeah, I can't give you the percentage off the top of my head, Tucker, but it is a minor component.
It's a minor component. All right. And my last question to you is, if I questioned that and I said, well, look, I'm not denying all of climate science, but a lot of the models have been wrong, as you know, over the past 60 years. They have been. And you would concede that. Maybe it's 50%. Would you call me a denier or a skeptic, or would you say, no, that's the kind of thing that people interested in science ought to be asking?
Tucker, I want to get our scientists together with people that you want to have debate this, and let's have a conversation.
I'm asking you as someone who represents settled science. What's the answer?
I welcome the questioning. I think when you look at the evidence, you'll come to the same conclusion I have.
All right. Fred, thanks a lot for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.